So you can see, Julius, now we got 35 minutes for questions and answers. So what I'm going to do pretty fast. We don't have much time, as you know. Julia is gonna keep us running and keep us tight in the time. But so I invite all the people to ask questions to the speakers of today. So in a summary, we have just got Fred Provenza talking about we are the earth is us. In the session one, in stream one, which I chair, we got Hans Hire talking about the collapse of chaos and cues to sustainable systems design, and we had Alan Savory talking about Multi-Scapes. So I'll invite the other chairs of the session one to just briefly introduce their speakers, and then we open the general questions and answers.
Thanks, Pablo. So I chaired Professor Augustin Del Prado, and he talked about the concept of global warming potential in grassland-based livestock systems, and to basically eliminate impact assessments.
Good. Ian?
Hi, I chaired Hamish Rennie. Excellent talk. And Hamish, do you want to give a 1-minute summary of your talk?
I was kind of hoping you would, then I'd know what I said.
Yeah, no. I'm following on from what Pablo did in the previous session, so I handing it over to other people.
So very briefly, I was looking at in the high country of New Zealand as an example of our sort of grazing landscapes in New Zealand. The fact that the high country is full of a multiple range of different people with different interests and different roles, and there are multiple agencies with different governance roles over those. And looking at the question of whether we needed to adopt a alternative system to what we have currently in New Zealand, our sort of semi-neoliberal system, and go for a more community-based approach, or was in fact our focus on our neoliberal system actually facilitating and causing a community-driven outcome in any case, focused around the quality of water as a uniting sort of feature, and using the example of Wanaka in New Zealand as a means of drawing all the community together, and that maybe we didn't have to move from neoliberal approach at all.
Thank you, Hamish. So now we open the floor for questions, thoughts, and challenge if you like to. So please don't hesitate to voice your question out. We got the speakers, and so if someone is shy enough, please let me know through the chat. Ian, go ahead.
I think it picks up on something that Hamish said, and maybe something that Fred didn't draw out as much. It's around the idea of First Nations. So in the New Zealand context, where you're looking at the use of land from, inverted commas, farmers, and the ways in which the neoliberal approach towards farming has led to some real challenges because of the lack of an understanding of the relationship between farming practice and externality. How First Nations concepts and ideas can be brought into future farming that allows for a more holistic engagement between farming practices and land management, and the way in which then regulatory frameworks within governments allow First Nations approaches to be differentiated from what could be seen as traditional Western approaches. And I probably want to go to Hamish first and then see if Fred's got a comment as well.
So as I mentioned in response to a question from Suzanne in my session, the New Zealand regulatory approach requires basically all of the planning in New Zealand to give effect to, or to take into account the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And consequently, in our processes, there's considerable dialogue, and increasingly so, between local government and Maori tribal authorities, and even more so our plans and our policies are underpinned by concepts from Maoridom, like Te Mano Te Wai, which is basically placing the water at the heart of the health of water at the heart of things, and then comes community use, and then comes after that economic use. So you start with making sure you have healthy ecosystems, healthy water, and you also take an integrated approach. I didn't mention this in our session, but Tutu Kitai, which is from the mountains to the sea, also integrating through those catchment type approaches. So having that core legislation as an anchor on which your plans and so on have to sit, I think has been critical for that implementation in New Zealand. Before we had that, Indigenous people were largely ignored in New Zealand. I think they now have a very strong voice. They would argue they need a stronger one, but I think that's where we're at.
Great question, Ian. I'll simply reflect on what I'm seeing here in the US, and that is much, much greater appreciation of the ways of Indigenous peoples, their relationships with landscapes. And I see that playing out now. Years ago, when you would go to a conference, there would not be Indigenous people there speaking about their ways and what they did and their relationship with landscapes. It's very common now to see them participating in conferences and at many, many different scales. Where all that'll play out in terms of policy and so forth and so on, I'm not sure. But certainly, I think at least among some people, there's this growing awareness that their links with landscapes physically and spiritually was very, very important. And their ability to survive in these landscapes for long time periods was linked to that. So.
Thank you very much, Fred. We got a question for Hans from Belmonte from Brazil. Fantastic. Could Professor Hans and Fred comment on the stability rigidity paradigm and the difficulty of humans have in understanding the intrinsic resiliency of nature systems, especially in the Western view? We may have just lost it. Fred, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, Pablo, and you might be good to comment on that as well. I think that what Hans was talking about, and Alan also, you know, the linear deterministic kind of ways that science has been conducted and that we view science, we have to move away from that kind of view to one that embraces this notion of self-organizing systems and complexity and so forth. And I think that's how we get people outside of these kind of conferences, people that could live in my neighborhood, how we get people to start to understand and appreciate that, I think that's a really good question. When we bring people over to our place here and we walk around and we talk about these kind of issues, light bulbs go on because you're able to show the resilience and the ability of these plants. You don't have to be watered year round. Just to try to get individuals to think about the complexity and the dynamism and the resilience of ecological systems is it's a very important issue, no question about that.
Thank you, Fred. That's fantastic. Just so you know, Hans had just to leave for urgent matter. For someone that knows Hans, it's very important. He will be back later on. Susie, you got a question there, and then we go to Ritodi.
Yeah, thanks for that amazing talk, Fred. I've actually coincidentally just spent a week on a writing retreat with a colleague. I'm writing a paper on the relationship of people with nature, and we were grappling with those very issues about connectedness to nature and sustainability and so on. And one of the things we were grappling with, and I think all of us are grappling with, is, you know, we can see it for ourselves, but how do we, you know, how does this become global policy and practice? How do people who don't see that connection become aware of it? How do people become reconnected with nature when, you know, they live in this hyper-capitalist society? And it's not necessarily just a question for Fred. I think all of us here in this virtual room probably have grappled with this. So I'd just be interested to hear some comments.
I'll say a word real quick to that, Susie, and then let other people speak. I think of that all the time, and I think, what can each one of us do? How can each one of us try to get at the emotional center of people? It's not a cognitive thing. It's how do we connect them? And I often think to books like Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, and he wrote in such evocative, powerful ways. And so how do we take that kind of approach and get that out there to people, to the common people? And I think the timing is good with the pandemic, with the issues of climate change. The amount of people that are going to national parks nowadays is stunning here in the United States. So I think it's a great chance for us to hook up with people in media that know how to reach people at a more general scale, and to try to have that transformation of consciousness of people around the globe.
Ritoli.
Thanks, Pablo. I mean, I kind of want to address the question that Ian asked, right, about First Nations people and indigenous knowledge within, you know, these broader agroecological systems. I think for me, one of the issues I've seen, and it's not just this conference, it's just all kinds of work around this, is that there's a real scalar mismatch, right? People talk a lot about indigenous knowledge in this very abstract sense, right? This cosmological entity that's out there, indigenous knowledge, and then practitioners show up, and somehow we get from this very abstraction to this very empirical functional system. And this is inherently the issue, right? Because what we need is some kind of engagement with the minutiae, right? With the tools of how you go from this very abstract thing to this very regulatory functional apparatus. And so I think there's three things to consider here, which I feel are at the forefront right now of allowing truly representational, truly just frameworks to emerge. The first thing is about finding, I would say, indicators and assessment and evaluation networks that involve variables that are not simply biophysical. And I see that here in New Zealand a lot. Something like Mahinga Kai, which is, you know, the health of a food gathering site, is overwhelmingly represented by biophysical variables. People are conducting tests on fecal matter in water, or conductance, or chemical, biological, and physical properties. While this is important, it's just telling one part of the story. Because as we know, indigenous cultures think of knowledge as both material and more than material, human and more than human. And this is one, right? Pluralizing our indicator sets. Second is, you know, the state in most of these countries, in anywhere, honestly, in the world, is a colonial state. And therefore, the judicial system is a reflection of that colonization. So there has to be an understanding of judicial pluralism, right? How are the courts failing us? How is the judicial system actually failing to uphold a sense of justice, a sense of equity that, let's say, First Nations people want? And if we don't have that notion foregrounded in our frameworks, then we are failing to incorporate in any meaningful way this very abstract indigenous knowledge that we speak of. And then finally, there is this thing about borders, right? Like, I know Hamish talked about the catchment scale. Whenever we as scientists or knowledge producers or whatever you want to call us, we are drawing a border around a system, we are again echoing, let's say, judicial markers, right? Let's say a block level, a city, a municipal limit, something like that. Or we are going by ecological borders, right? The rangeland of a species, or let's say where a watershed ends or begins. But that again, is partial, right? Because in the indigenous worldview, human and nature are not that separate, right? That connectivity is, again, not reflected by the way that we are drawing borders around our systems. And so for me, I feel if we want to realistically involve indigenous knowledge within our agroecological systems, then we have to pursue, indicator-based pluralism. We have to pursue judicial pluralism, and we have to rethink how we draw borders around our systems.
Thank you, Ritodi, for clarifying that question. I wish I could have done the same thing. Fantastic. You're an asset, let me tell you. Susie and Hamish.
Just a short comment. Ritodi, you're talking about borders and pluralism, and Fred was talking about xenophobia. And I guess in many places, we're not just having to consider First Nations, but there's often layers and layers of people who have arrived at various times, including recent immigrants and foreigners. I mean, here in South Africa, we have the Khoisan, who would be the First Nation here. We have the Nguni, various groups who came a lot later, and then the Europeans. And there's so many different worldviews and ways of being in the world and ways of valuing plants, animals, and landscapes. And it's hugely complex. And it's absolutely essential that indigenous knowledge is part of it. But I think to actually be genuinely plural, it's a huge challenge, but I think that is going to be the way to try and achieve some kind of sustainability.
Thank you, Susie. Hamish?
Yeah, thanks, Susie. Thanks, Ritodi. I agree fully with what Ritodi said about the artificiality of the boundaries we draw around things and so on. And I think it's also important to remember that when we look at the Māori approaches in New Zealand, they also drew boundaries around things when they were wanting to manage them. So they put a rahui, a temporary closure on certain things for maybe spiritual reasons, or for presence of abundance, which is also connected with the spirituality of the resource. So when we actually come to implement things, we do end up having to put some sort of boundaries around things to be able to communicate with each other what is and is not acceptable, to be able to manage each other's interactions with it. And I don't think we can get past bounding things, but I think that I totally agree that the plurality of that and the recognition and the empowerment of the different peoples who coexist and have coexisting sort of perspectives on these landscapes is critical. And I think it's really important to avoid thinking about integrating those approaches and think about them as coexisting, and how to interface between them without trying to integrate them into one catch-all, be-all system. I think that's where we've possibly gone wrong in the past, and I hope we're trying to get that better now.
Thank you for your comments, Hamish.
I've been listening very carefully, so my comments will be a number. Fred, I loved your piece when you talked about changing consciousness, etc. But bear in mind that all management is at scale. All right, so it's through institutions and they're complex. And what I didn't get time in my talk to point out is, if you take a very simple consciousness thing, Christ, if you just take one religion, Christianity, he preached love and caring. Okay, that was, millions of Christians can do that. Now, the moment institutions organized religion, what happened? We now have over 1,600 religious organizations. For centuries, Catholics and Protestants were torturing each other, killing each other, absolute going the opposite with institutions. And I'm just looking at one there. If you look at another, I mentioned wicked problems. These are wicked problems. There's not people being bad. We've got to manage, and we've got to manage through institutions that have wicked problems. One is they're incapable of common sense. You can ask any American here, does it make sense to produce oil, to produce corn, to produce fuel? And they'll say, that's stupid. Thousands of highly intelligent people with PhDs are doing it because they work in institutions. How many are protesting? Almost none. And if you take another institutional example, the Catholic Church, and I'm just picking one, I could pick any religion, the institutions not only are incapable of common sense, no matter how brilliant the people, you can put all of us in it, we still would be incapable of common sense if we work in an institution. Now, further evidence of this institutional behavior is that they won't admit error. When I was a government researcher, I did the research, and that research led to my institution shooting 40,000 elephants. When I confessed to that on a TED talk in 2013, I got criticized by academics and institutions around the world. What sort of man is this who will admit to that? To this day, 50 years later, none of the institutions have admitted error. It got worse, not better. Now, if we look at institutions, how many centuries has the Catholic Church known about pedophile priests? Their role is to protect the innocent. That's their purpose. But they protected the chief priests and the church. And this does not change till public opinion changes. So that's only beginning to change centuries later because the public now know about it enough. So we've got to manage through institutions. That's a problem that we can deal with if you take up the resolution I said. We learned how to deal with that. We then got blocked by institutions. The institutions that commissioned me to do that with 2,000 scientists then banned all institutions from being trained. Set us back 40 years. Nobody was being wicked. They're all good people like us, but they work in institutions. So it's very critical, I think, that you think about that. When we talk about Maoris and Native Americans and so on, bear in mind I said that we think we've got millions of ways of managing. We've thought that for 10,000 years or more. All humans make decisions exactly the same way. There is no noble savage. More than 20 civilizations have failed in every region of the world. The only place we've maintained civilization for a long time is Lower Egypt, but it took the destruction of Ethiopia to provide the silt. So when we look at, I mean, when I was studying the New Zealand situation and the world situation, I found records of, in New Zealand, of some of the, up to 90,000 moas being killed in one site. Very few eaten, because humans could kill whole herds easier than one animal with fire and organization and language. We got language. There was no noble savage. We've never been able to maintain civilization. That's what we're trying to do now. So when I helped with the US here, we talk of Native Americans. No, that's a bureaucratic term. Native and non-native is not science. That's bureaucratic administration. You set a certain date. If it arrived a week later, it's non-native. Native Americans are not native. But when we were studying and working with them and training Navajos and so on, they told me how terribly conservative they were. They would never adopt holistic management. And I said, nonsense. Where did you get your big cowboy hats? Where did you get your big boots? Where did you get your pickups? Where did you get your rifles? Where did you get your horses? Where did you get your sheep? Every bit of technology or anything, people latch onto it because they make decisions the same way. So rather than me give a long talk on this, we can cut through it if we just get our institutions, starting with one, to develop a policy in a national holistic context. Now, when we did that in Zimbabwe as a trial, we just took, because of my past connections, we just took 35 members of parliament from two opposing parties. They made Republicans and Democrats in America look like kids playing together in the playpen. They were killing each other. Now, when we took that, our staff appealed to me not to touch land and agriculture because it would break into violence. But I said, don't worry what I'm going to do. With them, I just talked to them about how governments develop policies. whether dictatorship, democracy, doesn't matter what political party, every government develops policy identically. I had to be president of a political party with my shadow cabinet before I learned that. And so we talked about that. And then I said, we can develop policy instead of trying to work with integrated teams of scientists, etc. The management is still reductionist. We can do it if we develop a national holistic context with total agreement. An hour later, we had total agreement. Every person in the country wanted to be more secure, more safe, better educated, clean water, clean air. We tied that to our behavior, to our environment. And suddenly, we didn't have opposing political parties. We had 35 Zimbabweans working together. And by the end of that workshop, we had an agricultural policy that the world dreams of. We would be the first country in the world producing more food than dead eroding soil. And we'd have various things going on. I don't want to take up your time now, all right? And we had shock from those members of parliament. They said, we've had World Bank, we've had consultants, we've had endless people advising us. We've never had anybody explain how simple it is to do if we just manage holistically. And they said, we've got to get this done at cabinet level, and we are now planning to do that. I'm in talks with the president, and we're planning to do that.
Thank you, Alan.
The first country to do it, it'll be wonderful. And it'll bring in all the indigenous knowledge. It'll bring in all the science, because there's nothing wrong with science. Reductionist science isn't the problem. I wouldn't be alive without it. I've had polio, I've been shot twice, I've had cancer, I've had numerous injuries. I wouldn't even be alive without reductionist science. Thank God for reductionist science. It's not our problem. Our problem is reductionist management. We have to start talking about it, or it will, as Fred said there, humans, the world go on without us.
Thank you, Alan. Hamish, you got a question, and then we got another question from Femi, which I would encourage to voice out.
Okay, just a smaller comment than anything. Alan pointed out the damage done by Maori in New Zealand to the environment, and yes, we totally agree. The noble savage myth is problematic, and certainly in our courses here we teach about the destruction caused with the population, the technology available. But I think the other thing I've thought about this a lot is that over time, people learn to live with the place. They learn from their mistakes, or they don't survive as a civilization. And the argument that we have in New Zealand is that essentially tangata whenua Maori did develop knowledge over time. Then they were introduced to new technology and were sort of, in a sense, colonized by the new people, and sort of felt that their knowledge wasn't up to it, or were forcibly not allowed to exercise their knowledge and power. And I think what we're seeing now is, on a global scale, our civilization, which has really only been going for a couple of 100 years in its current state of technological development, learning to live with the environment, and we're learning through our mistakes. And that was essentially Maori were here for 800 years before us, learned to live with their mistakes, from their mistakes. And I think that's what we're doing now. And I think this management issues is a key thing. Institutions trying to learn how to work together holistically in a way that survives for all of us is the key. But we're learning from our mistakes.